Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It started with a dream, but that was weeks ago. How does one explain a feeling of dread that lingers when you wake, a sense that the world around you has shifted just enough for you to notice but not enough to fully grasp? It's subtle at first, a sound you hear in the distance, a shadow that feels wrong, the weight of a stare that isn't there. You tell yourself it's nothing, a trick of the mind. But deep down, you know. It started like any other dream. I was standing in an unfamiliar room, cold and dimly lit. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The air was thick, oppressive. And then there was the smell, a sharp, acrid stench, like something burning. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. My breath quickened, my heart began to race. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, cloaked in shadows. Its presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. I could barely make out its features, just a vague silhouette against the dim light. And yet, its eyes, those eyes, I could feel them boring into me, even if I couldn't see them clearly. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The figure moved closer, its steps slow, deliberate. And then, just before it reached me, I woke up. My body was covered in sweat. My heart still thumped erratically in my chest. But when I looked around, everything seemed normal, too normal. The clock read 3 a.m. The sound of rain tapping against my window was the only thing that filled the silence. I tried to shake the feeling off. It was just a dream, right? Just a nightmare. But it didn't stop there. The dreams became more frequent. Every night, without fail. And each one felt more real than the last. The figure in the shadows, closer now, its presence heavier. The smell, sharper. The suffocating feeling, more intense. And then, there was the sound, a faint whisper in the back of my mind, like a voice calling from far away. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard. The lines between dream and reality began to blur. I'd wake up, only to hear the whispers in the dead of night, just as I would in my dreams. The shadows in my room didn't seem as still as they once had been. Every corner seemed to hide something, something waiting, watching. I had to figure out what was happening. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped between two worlds, unable to tell where one ended and the other began. But how do you confront something when you don't even know what it is? The first sign came on a rainy evening, much like the one when it all began. I was walking home from work, the steady rhythm of my footsteps echoing on the wet pavement, when I saw it, just at the corner of my vision, a shadow darting behind a tree. My heart stopped. I didn't want to look. I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen anything, but my feet moved on their own, drawn toward it. When I reached the tree, there was nothing there. Just the sound of rain and the creak of branches swaying in the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. The same feeling I had in my dreams, like I was being watched. I turned, my breath catching, but nothing was out of place. I was being paranoid, I told myself. Nothing was wrong. But it didn't end there. The following night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, louder. A voice, low and guttural, just beyond the edge of my hearing. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It felt as though it was in the walls, in the floor, under my skin. My breath became shallow, and the hairs on my neck stood up. I tried to get out of bed, but my body wouldn't move. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching, reaching toward me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The figure from my dreams, I could feel it in the room with me. I turned my head, and there it was. Just as before, its form barely visible, but its eyes, those eyes, locked onto mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was a blur of panic. The air was thick with something I couldn't explain, a suffocating pressure that weighed on me like 1,000 pounds. I closed my eyes, hoping it would go away, but when I opened them again, the figure was closer, so close I could almost feel its cold breath on my skin. And then, the whisper stopped. The room was silent. I blinked. It was gone. But the feeling remained. The coldness, the unease, the certainty that something had been there, something I couldn't quite grasp. I knew then that these weren't just dreams. They were memories. And they weren't mine. As I lay there in the silence of my room, staring at the ceiling, a thought gripped me, a terrifying thought. What if this was more than just a dream? What if these were glimpses into something darker, something I wasn't meant to understand? And why was I seeing them? Was I being warned? Or was I being haunted? It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was that I had to find out what it all meant. The next few nights blurred together in a haze of sleep deprivation and fear. The dreams continued, relentless, but now they felt more like memories than illusions. Every time I closed my eyes, the figure returned. It stood at the edge of my vision, just beyond my reach, waiting. And those whispers, those dreadful whispers, grew louder, closer, more demanding. They were no longer just sounds in the dark. They felt like they were coming from inside my head, as though someone was speaking directly into my mind. I could barely remember the last time I had a peaceful night's sleep. Each morning I woke up exhausted, my body aching from tension I couldn't explain. I didn't want to face another night of torment, but I had no choice. There was a sick pull, a magnetic force that drew me back into sleep, each night deeper into the suffocating grip of these dreams. The voice started to change. It was no longer a vague whisper, but now it was distinct, low and guttural, like a growl vibrating in the back of my skull. It spoke words, phrases, sometimes whole sentences, though they made no sense. It was as if it was trying to communicate something important, but all I could make out was a jumble of broken sentences, words that didn't belong together. But then, one night, as I was slipping in and out of consciousness, I heard it more clearly. Find the mirror, find the truth. The words echoed in my mind, chilling and sharp. I jerked awake, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air felt too still, the room too quiet. I glanced around, but nothing was there. The shadow, the figure, I couldn't see it, but I felt its presence, pressing in from all sides. I lay there in the dark, trying to gather my thoughts, but they scattered like dust in the wind. The mirror. What did it mean? I couldn't make sense of it. But one thing was clear, I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just a bad dream. This was something else. Something far more terrifying. The next day, I began my search. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was important, that it held the key to understanding these dreams, or whatever this thing was that haunted me. But there was no mirror in my room, none in the hallway, none in the apartment, for that matter. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a symbol, a manifestation of my growing anxiety. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I was missing something. Then, that evening, I went to my grandmother's house. She passed away a few months ago, and I hadn't been able to bring myself to go through her things. Her house still felt like it belonged to her, as if she were just in the other room, waiting for me to come back. It was a small, old house on the edge of town, quiet and secluded. The kind of place where time seemed to stand still. As I walked through the familiar rooms, the old wooden floors creaking under my feet, I noticed something that made my heart stop. There, in the far corner of the living room, stood an antique mirror. I didn't remember it being there before. It was large, with a heavy wooden frame that seemed out of place in the otherwise simple room. I approached it slowly, almost instinctively. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. But why hadn't I noticed it before? I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, but something was off. My own face seemed distant, like it wasn't mine. My eyes looked hollow, as though they had seen something they shouldn't. And then, the whisper came again, this time clearer than ever. Look behind you. My body froze. A cold chill washed over me, and for a moment, I didn't dare to turn around. But I had no choice. I had to see. I had to know. I slowly turned my head, and as I did, I saw it. The figure from my dreams. It stood in the doorway, just beyond the mirror's reflection. Its outline was blurry, shifting, like smoke, but the eyes, those eyes, I could see them clearly. They were glowing, red like embers in the dark. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, watching me. And then, a voice echoed in my head, clear as day. Come to me. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the mirror, at the thing in the reflection. The air was thick with dread, the silence deafening. I blinked, and in that instant, the figure was gone. Just like that. The doorway was empty, but the mirror still reflected my face, twisted with fear, eyes wide and unblinking. But then, I noticed something even worse. In the reflection, something moved. A shadow, too small to be mine, creeping across the floor behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, still and silent. I stumbled back, my heart racing, the whisper in my mind growing louder, clearer. Find the truth, or you will never wake again. I ran out of the house, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, locked safely inside. But even then, I knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just a bad dream. This was real. The question now wasn't just what the figure wanted, it was what it would do if I didn't find the truth. I couldn't stop shaking. Even after I slammed the door shut behind me, locked every window, and drew every curtain, I felt exposed. The silence in my apartment was suffocating, the quiet oppressive. My mind raced, bouncing from one horrifying thought to the next. What was that thing? Was it the same entity from my dreams? And the mirror, why did it seem like I'd been drawn to it? The question kept echoing in my mind. What truth did I need to find? I couldn't stay in my apartment. The walls felt too thin, the air too heavy. I knew I needed to get away, clear my head, but how? No matter where I went, the feeling of being watched lingered. The air around me felt thick with an unseen presence, like something was always just behind me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I forced myself to sleep, even though every part of me screamed not to. The dreams came again, more vivid, more real. But this time, something was different. I was back in my grandmother's house. The mirror loomed in the corner of the living room, just as it had in my waking moments, its surface reflecting not just the room, but something darker. The figure was there again, standing behind me in the reflection, its eyes burning with that same red, unblinking gaze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. But this time, the voice spoke again. "Find the door." I woke with a start, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The words hung in my mind like a ghost, repeating over and over, "Find the door." But what door? There was no door in my grandmother's house. At least none that I could remember. I had to go back. I had no choice. The sun was setting by the time I returned to the house, the shadows stretching long and ominous across the yard. My steps were hesitant as I crossed the threshold. The air inside was stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. Every creak of the floorboards underfoot seemed amplified, a cruel reminder that I wasn't alone. The mirror was still there, in the corner of the living room, just like before. But now, it felt even more oppressive. It wasn't just a reflection, it felt like a doorway, an opening to something far darker than anything I could imagine. I knew, without a doubt, that the figure was somewhere near, watching me. I tried to steady my breath, forcing myself to approach the mirror. The closer I got, the more distorted the reflection became. The edges of the glass rippled like water, and the shadows behind me twisted unnaturally. The figure wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving, taking shape, and it wasn't just in the reflection, it was in the room with me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My pulse was thudding in my ears. I turned back to the mirror, my eyes wide with panic. And then I saw it. A door, just behind the figure in the reflection. A small, wooden door that hadn't been there before. I could see it clearly now. The wood was dark, aged, and worn, its edges frayed and chipped. But the most disturbing part was the way it seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, breathing. "Find the door." I could hear the whisper again, faint but unmistakable. I took a hesitant step towards the mirror, my body trembling with each movement. My breath caught in my throat as I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered just inches from the glass. And then, before I could stop myself, my fingers brushed against the cold surface. A shock ran through me, sharp and jolting. My whole body tensed, my heart racing. I pulled my hand back instinctively, but it was too late. The mirror rippled, like the surface of a lake disturbed by a stone. Suddenly, the room seemed to tilt, the floor buckling beneath me. I stumbled, caught off guard, and before I could regain my balance, the mirror cracked, just a small, thin line at first, but it spread quickly, spider-webbing across the surface. I froze. The reflection of the door in the mirror didn't stay still. It moved. The door was opening slowly, creaking like something ancient, something forgotten. Without thinking, I reached forward again, my fingers brushing the glass, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something else behind it. Something alive. I jerked back, heart hammering in my chest. What was that? I'd seen it, those eyes. They were the same glowing red as the figure. But they were different now. Bigger. More alive. I could hear the whispers again, louder, growing more desperate, more frantic. "Come to the door, or it will come for you." The words were a warning, a threat. My head spun as I tried to process what was happening. The door was real. It had to be. And whatever was behind it, whatever was waiting on the other side, was far worse than anything I could have imagined. I had no choice. I had to go through. But what would happen if I did? Would I be trapped there in that world of shadows and horrors? Or would I find the truth I'd been searching for? I glanced once more at the mirror, the door now fully open, beckoning me with a sickening pull. And then, in the distance, I thought I heard a sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They were coming closer. I turned back to the mirror. The reflection was gone now. The door was no longer there. Just the shattered remnants of glass, sharp edges gleaming in the dim light. But I could still feel it. The pull. And I knew, deep down, that the door was not just a part of the dream. It was waiting for me. It always had been. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the broken mirror. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The reflection that had once been so clear, so real, was now just shattered fragments, pieces of glass that glimmered in the dim light. But I knew the door was still there. Somewhere, just beyond the shards, waiting. The footsteps. I could still hear them, faint but growing louder. Closer. I stepped back, my feet feeling like lead as they dragged across the warm wooden floor. The apartment felt too small now, too closed off. The walls were pressing in, suffocating me. I had to get out. I had to get away from this place, away from whatever was coming. But as I turned toward the door, a sudden noise stopped me, an almost imperceptible scrape, like something dragging across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps were no longer distant. They were right there. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Something inside me told me that if I did, if I looked back, I wouldn't survive what I saw. I had no choice but to keep moving, to keep pretending that there was no danger. I reached the door, the cold metal of the handle sharp against my palm. My fingers trembled as I twisted it, pulling the door open slowly. The hallway outside was dark, just as it had been before, but the feeling was different now. The shadows seemed deeper, as if they were alive, breathing, shifting with every flicker of the lights. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness. It pressed against me, pushing me forward. I didn't want to go down the hallway, but I didn't have a choice. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from this place as I could, but my feet moved on their own. The sound of the footsteps had stopped, but the weight of them hung in the air, like a presence that wasn't ready to let go. My mind raced with questions, but there were no answers. Not anymore. As I walked, the silence grew unbearable. Each step I took seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls, reverberating through my chest. The feeling of being watched was suffocating now. It wasn't just the sense of someone following me. It was as if something was ahead of me, waiting for me to walk into its trap. The door to the old apartment complex's staircase was at the end of the hallway. I reached it, but before I could touch the handle, I heard a whisper, so faint it almost wasn't real. "Don't go." I spun around, heart racing. There was nothing behind me. No footsteps, no shadows, just the cold emptiness of the hall. "Don't go." The whisper came again, louder this time, and I recognized it. It was my own voice. But how? How could it be me? I was alone. Wasn't I? I couldn't think. My mind was unraveling, the fear taking over. My hand shook as it hovered over the doorknob, my body trembling with the weight of something I couldn't explain. And then, without warning, I opened the door. The stairs creaked beneath me as I stepped inside. The darkness was almost absolute, except for the weak light coming from the window at the top of the stairs. It cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, twisting the world around me into something unrecognizable. I felt it again. The presence. It was there, just outside my line of sight. And then I heard it. A whisper. The same whisper I'd heard before. But this time, it wasn't just my voice. It was a chorus of voices, layered, overlapping, each one more desperate than the last. Come to us. The sound sent a chill down my spine. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I froze, standing motionless in the doorway. The darkness beyond was thick, almost alive, pulling at me, coaxing me forward. I didn't want to go. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to run. But I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand what was going on. I stepped forward, my feet dragging with every step. The air felt colder now, colder than before. My breath came out in visible puffs, but it wasn't the chill of winter. No, this was different. This was something unnatural. I reached the first step, and then the second. The building groaned as though it were alive, as though it were waking up to something. And then, for the briefest moment, the light flickered. The whispering stopped. For one long, terrifying second, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the overwhelming silence. And then, a thud. It came from above. My body went rigid. I looked up, but the darkness above was impenetrable. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything. But I felt something. Something waiting. I took another step, and then another, each movement becoming slower, more deliberate. The closer I got to the next landing, the more the darkness seemed to grow, folding in on itself, swallowing the light. And then, another thud. This one was louder. Closer. It was almost as if it were right above me. I didn't dare look up. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just flicker. They buzzed. The electric hum buzzed louder and louder, deafening. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my head, pounding against my skull. I had to move faster. I had to. With one last, desperate push, I ran up the stairs, past the landing, past the doors, toward the only thing I could see, a door at the end of the hallway, glowing faintly in the dark. And as I reached it, I heard something behind me. A breath. Heavy. Slow. It was close. So close. The breath was so close now. Too close. My heart slammed against my chest like a drum, and my skin prickled with the sensation of something lingering just behind me. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling violently. The cold metal felt like ice, almost too cold to touch. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back. I wrenched the door open, stepping inside the small room beyond, but as I did, the breath followed. It was there, right at my back. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The walls were cracked and peeling, the paint long faded, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly, casting erratic shadows against the walls. It looked like an old storage room, filled with nothing but dust and forgotten remnants. But I felt it. That presence. That thing that had been following me. It was still there, just beyond my line of sight, lurking in the darkness. I could hear it now, soft, slow steps, like the padding of bare feet on the floor. I felt the air change, thickening, becoming colder with each passing second. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, as though they were alive, reaching for me. I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs felt as though they were made of lead, too heavy to move. There was something wrong about this place. I could feel it deep in my bones. The air was stale, heavy with a presence that made my skin crawl. The room seemed to shrink around me, as though the walls were closing in, pushing me closer to the center of whatever nightmare was unfolding. I took a hesitant step forward, and the floor creaked beneath me. I froze. The sound was too loud, too deliberate. And then, from the corner of the room, a shadow stirred. It moved, shifting, stretching toward me with unnatural speed. I gasped, stumbling back, but the room seemed to twist with me, as though everything was spinning. The walls felt as if they were warping, bending in on themselves, pulling me into something else, a place where time no longer made sense. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. Tall, thin, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move like a person. It was wrong. Its limbs twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, and its head hung at an unnatural angle, as if it was too large for its neck. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat. My entire body was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of it. It was real. This was no dream. No hallucination. This thing, this creature, was standing right in front of me. It didn't speak. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence pressing on me. The air around me grew colder, colder than before. My breath came in sharp gasps, visible in the icy air, but the creature, it didn't seem to notice. It just watched. Every part of me screamed to run, but my body refused to move. I was trapped, held by some invisible force, my feet rooted to the ground. The figure took a slow step toward me, and my heart stopped. It knew I couldn't escape. I tried to turn away, to break free from the trance it had put me in, but it was useless. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was as if my very soul was being drawn toward it, like a moth to a flame. Another step. Closer. It reached out with its long, thin fingers. Its nails were jagged, sharp like broken glass. The moment its hand touched my arm, a surge of cold shot through my body, like an electric shock, but worse. It felt like ice had seeped into my veins, freezing me from the inside out. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even flinch. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure withdrew. It didn't retreat. It didn't vanish. It simply stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought I might finally be free. But the room had changed. It wasn't the same. The shadows were deeper, darker, swallowing the edges of the room. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something wrong. The figure wasn't gone. It was still there, somewhere in the room, watching, waiting. I was trapped. And then, as if to add to the nightmare, the whispers returned. Soft at first, just a murmur, like a breeze brushing through the trees. But the sound quickly grew, intensifying until it was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. "Come with us," they said. "It's too late to run." I tried to move. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. But the door, the one I'd come through, was gone. It had vanished. There was no way out. The walls were closer now, too close. I could feel them pressing in, suffocating me. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, filling my head, drying out everything else. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I collapsed to my knees, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My mind was spinning, unraveling in a mess of fear and confusion. What was happening? A shadow passed over me, and for the briefest moment, I felt a rush of cold air. It felt like something was moving in the dark, something far worse than anything I could imagine. My body trembled as the whispers grew louder. The walls were closing in, and the darkness was swallowing everything. The presence was coming. I didn't know if I was going to make it out of here. Have you ever heard a sound that shouldn't exist? The question hung in the air, sharp and chilling, as though it had been waiting for years to escape. I couldn't shake it. It crawled under my skin, turning my blood to ice. I knew, instinctively, that something about this place was wrong. I hadn't intended to stay here long. The old house was a curiosity, nothing more. I had been drawn to it out of sheer boredom, perhaps even a need to prove something to myself, something vague and undefined. The kind of impulse you get when your life feels like it's slipping through your fingers. You grasp for anything that might make you feel alive again. The house was nestled on the outskirts of the small town I'd recently moved to, a decaying relic of another time. Its windows were dark and unwelcoming, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. But the bells were what intrigued me. They didn't belong there. I first heard them while I was exploring the dusty attic. At first, I thought it was the wind, a draft playing tricks on the old wood. But the sound was too distinct, too rhythmic. A low, mournful chime that echoed through the house, sending a shiver down my spine. I looked around, confused, but found nothing, no bell, no mechanism to explain it. The attic was empty, save for forgotten boxes and furniture draped in white sheets. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination. The house had been abandoned for years. It was bound to make noises. But the bells were different. Each night they grew louder, more insistent, as though they were trying to tell me something. The chimes came from somewhere deep within the walls, reverberating through the very foundation of the house. And with each toll, something within me shifted. I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the sound. The air itself seemed thick with a strange tension and unease that I couldn't shake. I would often wake in the middle of the night to the scent of something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers, heavy and suffocating. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was my own guilt gnawing at me. Maybe it was my past, the things I had left behind. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just my mind playing tricks. The first time I saw it, I thought I was losing my mind. I'd been sitting in the living room, reading, when the shadow appeared in the corner of my eye. I turned, but nothing was there. I blinked, and it was gone. But it came back. The shadow lurked just out of sight, always moving just beyond the edges of my vision. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming. My heart would race, and I would strain to listen, to hear the bells, but they were silent just long enough to make me doubt myself. Was I going crazy? One night, the tension broke. I was in the hallway, moving towards the kitchen, when I heard the bells. They were louder now, almost deafening, and they seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound vibrated through my bones, a constant hum in my ears. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen, unable to move. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. And that's when I saw it. The figure. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the far end of the hallway. Its shape was indistinct, flickering in and out of existence, as if it couldn't decide whether to be real or not. It had no features, no face, no eyes. Just an endless void, swallowing the light. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were paralyzed. I couldn't breathe. The bells grew louder, more frantic, as if they were warning me. Get out. The voice was clear, distinct, cutting through the ringing in my ears. I blinked and the figure was gone. But the bells were still there. And they had never sounded so close. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Something in this house was trying to tell me something. Something I wasn't ready to understand. And I was beginning to think I might never be able to leave. The days blurred together. I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on me, a pressure I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. The bells continued, of course. Every night, without fail. They had become my constant companion, ringing through the silence of the house, refusing to be ignored. I stopped sleeping altogether. I had tried everything, closing the windows, staying out of the attic, even sealing off the doors to the rooms where the sound seemed to originate, but nothing worked. The bells kept coming, their mournful tone echoing in the dark, sending waves of unease through me. The closer I got to them, the more I felt as though something was waiting, watching. And then there were the shadows. They started small, like a trick of the light. A corner of the room that seemed darker than it should be. But over time, they became more distinct. I could feel them now. Every time I moved through the house, I could sense their presence just beyond my sight. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched. It was as if they were stalking me, moving with me, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, I decided to investigate the bells. I had grown desperate. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there was an old bell system hidden in the walls, or a broken mechanism I could fix. I started with the attic. I climbed the narrow staircase, my heart pounding in my chest, the smell of musty wood and rotting fabric heavy in the air. The old wooden floorboards creaked beneath my weight, groaning in protest as I moved deeper into the room. The attic was a maze of forgotten furniture and old boxes, piled high with dust and cobwebs. But the sound was louder now, almost unbearable. I walked slowly, tracing the walls with my fingertips, searching for any clue that might explain the source of the noise. My eyes darted around the dim room, flickering between shadows and flickering light. The chimes rang louder, closer. I could feel them in my chest now, each toll making my heart skip a beat. And then I found it. At the far corner of the attic, there was a section of the wall that looked different from the rest. It wasn't as old, as worn down. The wood was newer, the grain smoother. A chill ran down my spine as I approached it, my fingers brushing against the surface. The bells had come from here, I pressed my palm against the wood, and the ringing stopped. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. I pulled back, my mind racing. What had just happened? Before I could think, a sudden, sharp pain shot through my hand. I yelped, stumbling backward. My skin felt like it was burning. I looked down, expecting to see blood, but instead, there was nothing. Just an impression of a handprint burned into the surface of the wood. I knew then the bells weren't just a sound. They were a warning. I had to get out. But my feet wouldn't move. They felt glued to the floor, trapped by the same invisible force that had been following me since I set foot in this place. A voice, low and familiar, whispered in my ear. "Leave." It was a voice I had heard before, just the faintest echo, barely a whisper, but there it was again. The same voice from the hallway, from the night the figure had appeared. My heart slammed against my ribcage. I turned, frantically searching the room, but there was nothing. No figure. No shape in the shadows. Only the echo of the bells, ringing in the distance, louder than ever before. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out of the attic. I needed air. I needed to leave this place behind. I stumbled down the stairs, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The house seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing with every step I took. The ringing of the bells was deafening now, swirling around me as if they were inside my head, pushing me further into panic. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, something caught my eye. The door to the living room. It was ajar. I had locked it earlier that day. I was sure of it. But now it stood open, as if waiting for me. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me. But I had no choice. The bell's chimes were relentless now, urging me forward, a symphony of terror. I stepped into the room, my hand trembling as I pushed the door fully open. The air inside was thick with the same strange sweetness, the same rotting flower scent. And then I saw it. The figure stood there, in the corner, as it had before. This time, it was clearer, more defined. Its outline flickered like static, but I could see it now, tall and thin, its limbs too long, too angular. The darkness clung to it like a second skin, and its face, there was no face. Only a void where its features should have been. The bells rang, louder, closer. I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground. The air grew colder, biting at my skin. The figure didn't move at first, but its presence was suffocating. It didn't need to move. The very sight of it made me feel small, insignificant, as if I were being consumed by something ancient, something beyond my understanding. A voice came again, this time clear and demanding. "Leave, before it's too late." My mind raced. What was it trying to tell me? What did it want? I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and bolted, running through the house like a wild animal, desperate to escape the thing that had been haunting me for days, weeks maybe. The bells followed me, ringing in my ears, a constant reminder that I couldn't escape. I ran out the front door, into the cold night air, not daring to look back. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was far from that house. But even as I ran, I could hear the bells. Faint, but always there, echoing in the distance, as if they were calling me back. And the shadow? It was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. Watching. Waiting. I ran without thinking, the cold night air sharp against my skin, but my legs felt heavy, as if the weight of what I had just witnessed was dragging me down. The house behind me loomed in the distance, dark and silent, but I could still feel its presence. The bells, the shadows, they were all still with me, even though I was miles away. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to escape, to get as far away from that house as I could. But the more distance I put between myself and the place, the more I began to realize something. It wasn't over. The ringing had stopped. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing and my pounding heartbeat. But then it returned, faint but unmistakable. The bells. They were still calling me. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath clouded in the air, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining it. It couldn't be. I was out of the house. I was free. But the bells were closer now. They weren't coming from the house anymore. They were coming from inside my mind. I shivered, my fingers trembling as I touched my forehead. The cool air didn't seem to help, and the tightness in my chest grew stronger, as though invisible hands were squeezing the life out of me. I had to get away from it. But how could I escape something that followed me even into the world outside? I turned and ran again, my feet stumbling over uneven ground, pushing myself harder, faster. But the bells, they didn't fade. They grew louder. Each chime felt like it was shaking the very core of my being. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I had to get to the car. I had to leave town. It was the only way. But when I reached the road, my heart sank. The car was gone. I stared at the empty parking spot, my hands shaking. I had parked it there just hours ago. It had been fine when I left the house. There was no way it should have moved. Panic surged through me. Stop it. This is just in your head, I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Just breathe. Just breathe. But then, behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I froze. The steps weren't mine. They were heavy, slow, deliberate. I turned around, heart hammering in my chest, expecting to see something, someone, but there was no one. The street was empty. Yet the footsteps continued, getting louder, closer. I backed up, trying to steady myself, but my legs felt like jelly. I turned again and ran, this time not caring where I was going. It was as if the entire world had become a maze I couldn't escape. No matter where I went, the bells followed. The footsteps, too. I ran until I couldn't breathe anymore, until my lungs burned with every ragged gasp of air. My eyes were blurred with sweat and tears, but when I finally stopped, I realized I was standing in front of the house again. Ow! The bells were louder now, practically deafening. They rang from every direction, every corner of my mind. I could feel them in my bones. They were pulling me back. The house, no, the thing inside it, was calling me. I stumbled toward the front door, and before I knew it, my hand was on the knob, turning it. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I stepped inside. The air was thick again. The same musty, rotting smell filled the space, choking me. The walls seemed to close in as I stepped deeper into the house, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The bells continued, their echo reverberating through the entire house, but now they were different. They weren't just ringing anymore. They were speaking. A voice, deep and distorted, filtered through the sound. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them, feel the pressure in my head as though something was trying to communicate with me. I put my hands over my ears, desperate to block it out, but the sound only grew stronger, more insistent. The figure appeared again. This time, it wasn't just in the corner of my eye. It was there, standing at the far end of the hallway, tall and dark, its limbs impossibly long. The absence of a face was still the most terrifying thing about it. A void of nothing, consuming the light around it. "Why are you here?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. The bells stopped ringing, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the voice came, clearer now. "You shouldn't have come back." I backed away, my eyes wide, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. "Why are you following me?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, but the walls around me seemed to shift, the floor groaning as though the house itself were alive, breathing, shifting. "You awakened us," it said, its voice low and hoarse, a rasp that scraped against my mind. The bells have woken us." I didn't understand. "Who are you? What are you?" The figure tilted its head slightly, its form shifting, flickering like static on an old television screen. "We are the forgotten," it replied. "We are the ones buried beneath. The ones the house tried to hide. And you've disturbed us." The ground beneath my feet trembled. I looked around in terror. The walls seemed to pulse, as though something inside them were moving, reaching for me. "No, I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter," the voice interrupted. "The bells will keep ringing until we are free. And you will be here with us, forever." I turned, running through the house once more, but the walls seemed to stretch and shift, closing in on me from all sides. The air was thick, suffocating. I tried the windows, they were sealed shut, no matter how hard I pushed. I turned, desperate, looking for an exit. But there was no way out. I was trapped. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, drowning out all coherent thought. I had to get out. I had to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how desperately I tried to find a way out, the house, no, the thing inside it, was always one step ahead. The walls creaked and groaned as though the house were shifting, bending to trap me. Every step I took seemed to take me deeper into its heart, into the very pulse of its decay. The floor beneath me rattled, the air heavy and cold, the shadows pressing on me like they were alive, hungry. The bells, those cursed bells, rang louder, deafening, every chime like a hammer striking against my skull. I stumbled through the hallway, my vision blurred, my senses overloaded. The house was alive with noise. Not just the bells. The walls hummed with something else, something darker. There were whispers now, too. Quiet at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but soon growing louder, closer. It was a chorus of voices, murmuring, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. But the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from everywhere, from beneath the floorboards, from the walls, from the very air I breathed. "Make it stop!" I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the noise, lost in the overwhelming cacophony. I was losing control. My body moved on its own, as though it were being guided by something beyond my comprehension. I tried to focus, to regain my bearings, but everything around me seemed to blur, to twist into shapes that made no sense. The very space I was in felt like it was folding in on itself. And then I saw it again. The figure. This time, it was not just in the corner of my eye. It stood in front of me, blocking the hallway, a silhouette of dark, shifting mass. Its limbs were unnaturally long, reaching out toward me, its form distorting and flickering as if it were not entirely part of this world. Its absence of a face was the worst part. There was nothing where its eyes should have been, nothing where a mouth should have been. Just an endless, gaping void that seemed to pull in all the light around it. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't speak this time, but its presence was more oppressive than ever. The room seemed to constrict around me, the air thick with tension, suffocating. "You can't leave," the voice came again, this time not from the figure but from the house itself, from the very walls, from the floor beneath my feet. It was the same voice I had heard earlier, distorted until it was almost unrecognizable. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. The figure tilted its head, the shadows around it warping and writhing. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. And then the voice spoke again, but this time it was not as cold, not as distant. "We were once like you," it said, and there was a strange, twisted empathy in its words. "We were trapped here too. By the bells. By the ones who came before." The words hit me like a wave, crashing over me with such force that I could hardly process them. Trapped. Trapped like me? The house had been here for centuries, I knew that much. It had always stood, a decaying relic of the past, haunted by some invisible force. But what was this? What were these things? What had happened here? The figure's shadow seemed to grow, extending down the hallway, crawling along the walls. It was as if it was trying to swallow the room whole, to devour the very light that remained. And I realized with a sickening jolt that the figure was not the only one. The whispers in the walls grew louder, no longer a mere murmur but a chorus of voices that seemed to scream, each one more desperate than the last. They were trapped here, like the figure had said. They had been here for years, for decades, maybe longer, held in place by the bells, by the same force that had been calling me, pulling me in. "You should not have come," the voice continued, the tone turning colder. "The bells have chosen you. You cannot escape." The floor trembled beneath me, the very ground vibrating with the force of whatever lay hidden beneath it. I looked around frantically, my heart racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Suddenly, the walls around me began to warp, the wood buckling and cracking as though something was pushing from the other side. The house felt alive. No, not alive. It was something older. Something hungry. And it was waking up. The whispers turned into wails, long and tortured, as though they were the cries of the forgotten souls that had once lived here, trapped in the same cursed house. They were desperate, pleading, begging for release. But there was no release. Not for them. And not for me. I turned, running again, my legs moving on their own, my feet barely able to keep up with the madness that consumed me. The bells kept ringing, louder now, a constant, shrieking presence in my mind. I couldn't escape. No matter where I went, the house seemed to stretch on forever, its walls closing in around me, its rooms shifting, expanding, swallowing me whole. I crashed into a door, knocking it open. The room inside was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of moonlight streaming through a cracked window. I backed into the corner of the room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My heart hammered in my chest. The walls were alive with movement, shadows flickering, and I could hear it, the faint sound of the bells, muffled, but still there. "Please, no more," I whispered, my voice breaking. But it was too late. The air around me thickened, the temperature dropping to an unbearable chill. I felt a presence behind me, and I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. The figure was there. I could feel it, a weight pressing against my back, its cold presence seeping into my skin. I was trapped. The house had won. It had been waiting for me all along. And now, it would claim me too. The bells rang, louder than ever. And then, in the deep, suffocating silence that followed, I felt it. The floor beneath me shifted. Something was rising from below. A scream tore from my throat, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The room seemed to close in around me, as if the very air had turned to stone. My chest was tight, suffocating. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, faster and faster, as the figure behind me grew nearer. The floor groaned beneath me, vibrating with the presence of something ancient and insidious. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place, as if the house itself were holding me captive. The bells, those damn bells, were louder now, their ringing reverberating through every inch of my skull. The sound was almost unbearable. I didn't dare turn around, but I didn't need to. I could feel it. The figure was behind me, its presence cold and consuming. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, reaching toward me like long, grasping fingers, waiting to pull me into the dark. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper, hoarse from the panic that gripped me. I knew it wouldn't answer. The figure had already spoken to me, but its words had been vague, cryptic, full of malice and regret. I couldn't make sense of them. "We're not your enemy," the voice spoke again, its tone softer now, almost pitying. "But we're bound to this place. To the bells. You are here now, just as they were. And you will stay. Forever." "No," I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want this." The figure seemed to step closer, though I couldn't see it. The shadows around me thickened, pressing in on me like a heavy fog. The air turned colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath rising in front of me. The cold was unbearable. It felt like it was sinking into my very bones. "You have already paid the price," the voice continued, each word thick with a sinister undertone. "The bells chose you, just as they chose those before you. The price of silence is eternal. Once the bells have called, they do not stop." The shadows around me pulsed in time with the ringing. Each chime felt like it was digging deeper into my mind, breaking apart everything I thought I knew. The walls were no longer just walls. They were alive, undulating with a dark energy, with a hunger that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Suddenly, there was movement in the corner of my vision, a flicker of motion. My head snapped toward it, my pulse racing. I saw it, an opening, a small crack in the wall, a sliver of light shining through. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark a desperate hope inside me. I didn't think. I just moved. I sprinted toward the crack, my feet stumbling on the uneven floor. The bells rang louder, as if they were trying to pull me back, to drag me into the depths of the house, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out. I had to find a way to break free. I reached the crack and shoved my fingers into the opening, pulling with all my strength. The walls groaned as if resisting me, but I didn't care. I pulled harder, my muscles aching, my fingers raw. Finally, the wall shifted. The crack widened just enough for me to squeeze through. I didn't hesitate. I crawled through the narrow opening, my body scraping against the rough stone walls. The sound of the bells was deafening now, a continuous, maddening ringing that seemed to tear at my insides. But I kept moving, crawling through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, as if the house itself were closing its grip on me, the crack vanished. I was trapped again. The walls around me shifted with a terrifying finality, and I was forced to stop. The darkness was absolute now, the air thick and suffocating. I could hear nothing but the sound of my breath and the bells, always the bells, ringing, ringing, ringing. And then, in that suffocating silence, a voice spoke again. "This is your home now," it said, and I could hear the pity in its words. "There is no escape. The bells will never stop calling. They will always find you. They have found us, and now they have found you." I wanted to scream, to deny it, to fight back. But the truth was undeniable. I was no longer in control. I was trapped in a nightmare that had no end. I slumped against the wall, my body trembling. The house, this place, was alive with history, with pain, with regret. The bells weren't just a sound. They were a presence, an entity that had existed long before I had set foot here, and they would remain long after I was gone. The whispers began again, low and guttural, scraping against the walls, rising from the floor beneath me. They grew louder, angrier. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. The house, no, the force within it, was demanding something. It was asking for more. I closed my eyes, fighting the rising tide of terror threatening to consume me. I had no choice now. The house had me. The bells had me. And there was no escape. The ringing was relentless, deafening. And then, in the quiet that followed, I heard it, the softest sound, a whisper so faint it was almost imperceptible. "Welcome home." The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, but there was something different about the sound. It wasn't the usual calm of a beach at dawn. No, this was a sound that seemed to echo something deeper, something forgotten. James had always come here to escape, to think. He was far away from the city, far away from everything. Just the sand, the sea, and his troubled thoughts. Yet, today, as his feet touched the cold, wet sand, something felt off. It was as though the air itself had thickened, carrying with it a heaviness that wasn't there yesterday. His gaze wandered over the shoreline, and that's when he saw it. The footprints. At first, he thought they were simply left by someone else, a late-night wanderer or a lone jogger. But the more he looked, the more he realized these were no ordinary footprints. They were too deep, too uneven, as if someone or something had dragged itself through the sand. The prints led toward the rocky outcrop in the distance, where the land jutted out into the sea. James stepped closer. His heart rate quickened. He knew that the beach was usually empty this early in the morning. There was no one else around for miles. No one to leave these prints. He knelt down to get a better look. The edges of the prints were oddly sharp, like they'd been made by something unnatural. Something heavy. Something that shouldn't have been here. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if the sand itself had burned him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Was it just his mind playing tricks? Maybe. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. A presence, cold, unnerving, hovering just out of sight. He could almost hear it in the silence, a subtle whisper beneath the roar of the waves. The air tasted wrong, too. Salty, yes, but with a sharp tang, like something decaying just beneath the surface of the water. He tried to shake off the unease and forced his feet to move forward. But as he walked along the edge of the beach, he could feel his steps growing heavier, like the sand was pulling at him. It didn't make sense. The ground should have been firm, but every step felt like a struggle, as if something beneath was holding him back, urging him to stop. And then there was a noise. A faint scraping sound, like metal dragging across stone. James froze. It wasn't the waves. It wasn't the wind. This was something else entirely. Something closer. He spun around, scanning the empty beach, but saw nothing. No one. Just the footprints in the sand, slowly filling with water as the tide crept closer. Was it his mind again? Or was there something out there, something that shouldn't be? A chill ran down his spine, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow, the air growing thick and heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that if he didn't leave now, he might not make it out of here. But as he turned to walk back toward the path leading to the parking lot, he saw it. A shadow. It was small at first, barely visible on the edge of his vision, but as his eyes adjusted, he could see it more clearly. It was moving. Not a person. Something else. The shadow was not defined. It wasn't shaped like a human, but it was definitely something. His breath caught in his throat. The shape seemed to hover at the edge of the rocks, shifting, twisting in ways that no human could. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. He blinked, and when his eyes opened again, it was gone. James shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He was losing it. He had to be. But even as he tried to convince himself, the cold feeling crept back. The shadow, whatever it was, wasn't the only thing that was wrong. The beach itself seemed to shift in the corner of his mind. The place he had known for years was no longer familiar. The sand, the sea, the sky, all of it felt wrong. As though it were being distorted, twisted by an unseen force. He turned to leave once more, but the sound, sharp, scraping, was there again. Louder this time. And this time, it wasn't just a noise. It felt deliberate. Someone, or something, was following him. He couldn't breathe. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, but he couldn't move. The air was thick, pressing on him, suffocating him. What was happening? Why was he alone on this beach? Why did it feel like the world around him was closing in? Suddenly, he could hear the whispers, low, guttural, just beneath the sound of the crashing waves. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel the malice in them, the coldness. James broke free of the paralysis and took off running, the sound of something following him growing louder with every step. The beach, once a place of solitude, now felt like a prison. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as if the world itself were trying to keep him there. He ran faster, his breath ragged, his thoughts scattered. He could feel his pulse in his throat, his legs burning from the effort, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Then he saw the path. The narrow trail that would lead him back to safety. But as he made to turn toward it, the ground beneath him gave way. The sand, soft, treacherous, shifted like quicksand, pulling him down. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the waves. James' heart was hammering in his chest as the sand continued to drag him down, its grip unrelenting. He fought against it, his hands flailing, trying to dig into the shifting grains, but it was like trying to escape quicksand. The harder he struggled, the deeper he sank. Panic flooded his veins, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The world around him was spinning, the ground beneath his feet becoming a cold, wet abyss. He could feel it pulling at his legs, at his arms, as though something unseen was reaching up from beneath, dragging him further into the earth. No! I can't! He was sinking faster now. The sand was up to his waist, his chest, and with each passing second, he felt the chill creeping into his bones. There was something wrong with the beach, something unnatural. He had felt it before, those whispers, the coldness, the shadows, but now it was all consuming, suffocating him. He had to get out. He had to move. But the more he fought, the more the sand seemed to laugh at his efforts, pulling him deeper, suffocating him with every inch. His eyes darted around desperately, looking for something, anything that could help him. Was this it? Was this how it was going to end? Was he really going to die here, swallowed by a beach that he had walked on so many times before? The thought made his throat tighten, his chest feeling as though it was caving in under the pressure. And then something shifted. A sound, faint but distinct, cut through the chaos of his thoughts. It was the scraping noise again. The same scraping, dragging sound he had heard earlier. He froze, every muscle in his body locking in place. The noise was coming from behind him, closer this time. His body screamed at him to move, but his limbs were sluggish, heavy, as if the very air around him had thickened into molasses. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. But as the scraping grew louder, more defined, James could no longer deny it. He wasn't alone. The presence was there, just behind him, just out of reach, yet so close that he could feel the cold brush of it against his skin. He shuddered, his body jerking involuntarily as the sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like something was breathing right next to him. A scream bubbled up in his throat, but it caught there, lodged like a stone. He couldn't scream. His body was frozen, held captive by the fear crawling through his veins. With great effort, he shifted his weight, trying to free himself from the sand's grasp. His arms trembled as he pushed against the ground, trying to claw his way out. But with every move, the sand seemed to close in tighter. And then, the shadow appeared again. This time, it wasn't just a flicker at the edge of his vision. No, this time, it was right there, looming over him. He turned his head just enough to catch a glimpse, and his stomach turned. The shadow was like a thing made of smoke, but with edges sharp and defined, like something not meant to be. It hovered just above the ground, not quite touching the sand, but so close that he could feel its presence, its coldness. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could understand. The shadow shifted, twisting like it was alive, moving toward him with a purpose. The scraping sound grew louder still, like claws on stone, and James' mind snapped. He had to get away. He pushed harder against the sand, the panic clawing at his chest as his arms burned with the effort. His body screamed at him to stop, to just give in, but he couldn't. Not now. Not when the thing was so close. His fingers brushed something solid, something different from the loose, shifting sand. A rock? No. A piece of driftwood, large and jagged. He grabbed it, his hand trembling as he held onto it for dear life. The scraping sound was deafening now, filling his ears, and without thinking, he swung the piece of wood behind him, hoping to strike something, anything. The shadow recoiled, pulling back as though burned by the touch of the wood, and for a moment, the scraping stopped. The air felt lighter. The coldness receded, just enough for him to take a breath. But that relief was short-lived. The moment the wood hit the sand, he realized that the threat wasn't just behind him. It was all around him. The ground began to shift again, the sand moving like something alive, pulling him down faster than before. The shadows twisted, stretching and contorting, and he could hear the whispering, louder now, more insistent. "You can't leave," it said, its voice like the wind, like the sound of something ancient. James froze. The voice was not his own thoughts. It wasn't just in his head. It was real. And it knew him. The sand was almost up to his neck now, and the wood in his hand felt like a weak defense against the rising tide of terror that threatened to drown him. The scraping sound returned, louder than ever, but it wasn't coming from behind him anymore. It was coming from all sides. What was happening? The shadow loomed above him, its shape now unmistakable, a grotesque, formless creature that seemed to ripple and pulse with a darkness that made his blood run cold. Its presence was suffocating, its form impossible to fully grasp. It was as if it wasn't meant to be here at all, like it was an intrusion from another world. James' mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be something. But as the shadow drew closer, he could feel it, the unmistakable pull of despair, the gnawing certainty that whatever this thing was, it had no intention of letting him go. The sand closed over his shoulders, his neck, and with it, his breath caught in his throat. This was it. He was going to die here. And yet, even in the depths of that suffocating fear, there was one thought that remained clear. The footprints. The prints in the sand. The ones that had led him here. Whoever, or whatever, had left them behind was connected to this thing. Was it a warning? A lure? His vision began to fade, and as the last of the air left his lungs, one question burned in his mind. What had happened here before? Before he could answer, everything went dark. James woke to a sudden, jarring sensation that seemed to snap him back into his body. His lungs screamed for air, and his heart pounded erratically in his chest. His eyes flew open, but all he could see was darkness, thick, oppressive darkness that pressed down on him from all sides. His body felt heavy, numb. His arms were still partially submerged in sand, but the suffocating grip that had been pulling him down was gone. The ground beneath him was solid again, but strange. Something about the texture was wrong. Where was he? A faint, ghostly glow filtered through the blackness around him, but it didn't come from any light source that made sense. It was as if the very air itself was glowing, a dim, otherworldly illumination that bathed everything in a sickly hue. The sound of the waves had disappeared completely, replaced by a stillness that made his ears ring. He could hear his own breathing, harsh and shallow, as he pushed himself to his hands and knees. Every muscle in his body screamed, but he didn't care. He had to get out of here. He had to escape whatever this place was. He stood, shakily, his legs unsteady beneath him. His eyes darted around, but all he saw was that same unnatural light that stretched out in every direction. No beach. No ocean. Just a cold, empty expanse that felt like it was nowhere at all. Where am I? His thoughts were a blur. The last thing he remembered was being pulled down by the sand, the scraping sound, the shadow that had almost consumed him. It felt like a nightmare, but his body still ached, the physical evidence of whatever had happened to him. He stumbled forward, each step heavier than the last, the ground beneath him soft, like wet clay. His feet left no footprints in the strange substance, and that only made his unease grow. The whispers returned, faint at first, but soon they were growing louder. The sound was unsettling, like thousands of voices murmuring in unison, but none of them quite clear. The closer he walked, the more it felt as though the voices were coming from within his own head, as if the very air was filled with the echoes of past thoughts, past lives. What is this place? The question burned in his mind, but he couldn't focus on it long enough to find an answer. A shape appeared ahead of him. It was blurry at first, a vague silhouette that seemed to shift and twist in the strange light, but as he approached, the details started to become clearer. It was a figure, standing motionless in the distance. At first, he thought it might be another person, another lost soul, someone who could help him. But as he drew nearer, he realized with a jolt that it wasn't human. The figure was tall and thin, too thin, its limbs unnaturally long and bending in strange angles that should have been impossible. It was draped in something like tattered fabric, but the fabric was wrong too. It fluttered in the windless air, shifting like it was alive, rippling with a kind of energy that made his skin crawl. James stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't just standing there. The figure was waiting for him. It wasn't moving, but it was aware of him, aware of his every step. The way its head tilted ever so slightly to the side made his blood run cold. It was as if it was studying him, evaluating him. Suddenly, the figure spoke. The words were soft at first, almost inaudible over the growing murmurs of the voices around him, but then they became clearer, each syllable dripping with an unnatural chill. "You should not be here," it whispered. James froze, every muscle in his body going rigid. His mind raced, his heart thundering in his chest. "What do you mean?" he choked out, his voice trembling. The figure's head tilted further, its impossibly long neck bending with an eerie, mechanical motion. It seemed to consider his question for a long moment before responding. "This place, this time, it is not yours." James swallowed hard, a sense of dread washing over him in waves. What was it talking about? What did it mean by time? "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse. He tried to take a step back, but his legs wouldn't obey him. It was as if the ground beneath him had grown roots, pinning him in place. He was trapped. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate. With each step, the ground seemed to tremble beneath its feet. The whispers grew louder, sharper, their voices becoming clearer and more insistent, like 1,000 hushed conversations overlapping each other. "You walked on the sand," it said, its voice now clearer, colder, and the sand remembers. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and his breath caught in his throat. The sand remembers? He had been on that beach, but that was before. Before the footprints, before the shadow. Before whatever had pulled him into this place. The figure extended one long, thin arm toward him, its fingers stretching unnaturally, reaching for him. It felt like time itself had stopped, the air growing impossibly heavy as the fingers grew closer. "Your footprints remain," it whispered, almost lovingly. "You cannot leave until they are erased." James recoiled, his body screaming in terror. He wanted to run, to fight, to do anything, but his body was frozen in place. The figure's gaze was suffocating, its presence consuming him entirely. The whispers grew louder, their volume reaching a crescendo until they were deafening, filling his mind with voices, with images, with sensations he couldn't understand. The world around him began to warp, twisting and distorting as if reality itself was breaking apart at the seams. The figure's fingers brushed against his skin, and he gasped as a jolt of ice-cold energy shot through him, making his blood run cold. "You cannot escape the past," it hissed. "The past is where you belong." Before he could react, the figure's arm shot out like a whip, its fingers gripping his throat with terrifying strength. James gasped for air, his chest constricting as the world around him spun. With one final, guttural whisper, the figure's voice pierced his mind. The sand remembers. And then, everything went black again. James' body jerked awake with a gasp, his lungs aching as they desperately pulled in air. His vision was blurry, and his head throbbed as if something had struck it, hard. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. There was a weight on his chest, a dampness around him, and the distinct smell of salt water mixed with something metallic, like rust, like blood. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, and as his eyes adjusted, the world slowly began to take shape. He was back on the beach. The same beach he had wandered onto just hours before. The same stretch of sand, the same crashing waves, and yet something was profoundly different. The sky above him was dark, but not with the soft, early evening hues he remembered. No, it was a deeper shade of black, like a bruise, suffocating and unnatural. The air felt heavy, thick with tension, and the waves that lapped against the shore sounded more like the growl of a beast than the gentle rhythm of the ocean. A sense of dread settled in his chest, tight and suffocating. He tried to move, but his limbs were stiff, as if they had been frozen in place. When he managed to sit up, his head spun, and he gasped, swallowing down a lump in his throat. The sand remembers. The words echoed in his mind, a haunting refrain that made the ground beneath him feel more like a trap. What was happening? He forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. His body was sore, battered, as if he had been through some kind of violent struggle. His fingers were still caked in sand, and he rubbed them together, trying to rid himself of the strange, coarse feeling. The whispers were faint but still there, barely perceptible beneath the roar of the ocean, like a faraway hum that made his skin crawl. Was it real? He glanced around. Everything seemed familiar, but in an alien way. The beach felt wrong. The sand wasn't just sand, it was heavier, more oppressive, as though it was trying to drag him under. The ocean, once calming, now seemed ominous, as if it were holding some terrible secret, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. He glanced back over his shoulder, and his breath caught. The footprints. The ones he had seen earlier. They were still there, deep, etched in the sand, leading away from the water's edge. They were clear now, unmistakable, and his heart pounded as he recognized them. They were his footprints, the same ones he had seen the first time, when he was walking along the shore, when he had first noticed that something was wrong. But there was something different about them now. They were deeper, as if they had been there much longer, as if they had been waiting for him. And they led to a place. No, not a place. A shape. It was a small, crumpled form sitting at the edge of the water, near where the footprints ended. James' pulse quickened. It looked like a person, but something about it was wrong. The way it sat, unmoving, its body slumped awkwardly, didn't seem natural. The whispers swirled around him again, louder now, almost in harmony, each voice distinct but echoing the same words. You shouldn't have come back. He could barely hear his own breath over the noise in his head. The figure in the sand shifted, its back hunched as if it could feel him watching it. Slowly, it turned toward him, and James' breath caught in his throat. The figure was a woman, or at least it had been once. Her skin was pale, waxy, stretched too thin across her bones, and her eyes were wide open, staring into nothing, unblinking. Her hair was matted to her scalp, tangled with seaweed, and her mouth was slightly agape, as if she had been screaming or gasping for air for days. But what made James' stomach twist in horror were her hands. They were bent at impossible angles, fingers cracked and contorted in ways that made his skin crawl. She was not alive. She was a thing, a corpse left out too long in the elements. A warning. A sign. The whispers, now sharper and more insistent, filled his mind. The past cannot be undone. The footprints remain. His eyes went to the ground, and with growing dread, he saw that the footprints, the ones leading to the body, were not the only ones. There were others. More footprints, more than he could count, some fresh, some older, each of them leading to the crumpled form. They were not just his. They were the footprints of others who had walked here. Others who had come before him. The weight in his chest grew heavier, pressing down on him as though the very air around him was closing in. His legs wobbled beneath him, his vision blurring as his mind reeled. He tried to move, to run, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The sand felt like quicksand, pulling him in, trapping him. Every step he took felt like a mile, and the whispers continued to crescendo, drowning out his thoughts. And then, the body moved. James froze in place, his blood turning to ice as the woman's body twitched, her head snapping unnaturally to face him. Her mouth opened wide, wider than it should, and the sound that escaped her was not human. It was a screech, a howl of agony, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The air seemed to vibrate with the force of the noise. The woman didn't speak. Her lips didn't move. But James heard her voice, clear and cold in his mind. You can't leave. You can't escape what's already been written. The ground trembled beneath him, and the sea began to churn violently, as though it, too, had heard her words. Waves surged higher, crashing against the shore with unnatural force. James stumbled back, his heart hammering, but the sand seemed to rise with him, as if the ground itself was fighting to keep him there. The figure lurched to its feet, moving slowly, stiffly, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. It was as if something had awoken in it, some lingering force that had been dormant for too long. James backed away, his pulse racing as the body, now upright, began to shuffle toward him. Its eyes were fixed on him, and the whispers intensified, blurring into a chaotic cacophony. You can't escape. It was no longer just one voice. It was hundreds, thousands, all speaking at once, their words blending into a distorted symphony of madness. His mind felt like it was fracturing under the weight of it, the voices invading every corner of his thoughts. The air felt cold, colder than it should, and the sky above was growing darker, as if something ancient was rising from the depths of the sea. The woman's head tilted, her eyes locking with his. You are part of the footprints now. And in that moment, James knew he was trapped. The past, the present, and the future were all entwined in this place. There was no escaping the beach. There was no escaping the footprints. Not anymore. The cold air pressed in on James, suffocating, choking every breath he tried to take. The whispers, no, the voices, surrounded him, their incessant hum like the sound of 1,000 lives colliding, each one trapped in the same twisted nightmare. His chest tightened, and his heart pounded in his ears, deafening him to anything but the cacophony of his own panic. The footprints. The words echoed in his mind, fading and returning with each frantic thought. They remembered. They knew. The past was written in the sand, in every step he had taken, in every soul who had wandered onto this cursed shore. James wasn't just a visitor here. He was a part of the endless cycle, caught in a web he couldn't see, a pattern he couldn't break. His eyes darted from the woman's figure, now standing fully upright, her body contorted like something not meant to walk this earth, to the dark horizon. The waves raged more fiercely now, crashing violently against the shore, their sound almost deafening, but still, the whispers came, relentless, pressing on his mind. The woman's eyes never left him. "You belong to the footprints now," she said again, her voice hollow, like a breath from a long-dead soul. It wasn't her voice that spoke, though. It was the collective murmuring of every soul that had walked this path before him, their voices melding together into one terrifying command. Her hand twitched, then slowly, agonizingly, she reached toward him, her fingers trembling with the same unnatural movement that had taken over her entire body. She was moving faster now, the slow, jerky motion giving way to something more urgent. The distance between them shrank with each labored step she took. James stumbled back, but his feet felt heavier with every motion, as though the ground was reaching up to hold him down, to anchor him to this cursed place. His breath hitched in his chest as he realized that with every step, the sand around him seemed to shift, to warp, as if it were alive and remembering. He needed to run. But where could he go? His legs trembled beneath him, his mind racing for an answer that didn't exist. His thoughts spiraled. He couldn't run. There was no escaping. This beach, this place, it was all he had, all he would ever have. He had become part of the endless chain, his fate sealed in the same footprints that led him to the woman, to the bodies, to the abyss. The woman stopped. Her hand hovered in the air before her, her fingers curling into a grotesque claw. She tilted her head, and for a moment it was as if she were listening to something, a sound that wasn't meant to be heard. The whispers grew louder, but now they carried a new edge, a sharpness that made James's ears bleed. The past is eroded. The future is written. The present is only the memory of what was. Her lips moved slowly, her mouth opening wider than should have been possible, her teeth unnaturally long. The voice that came from her was not hers, not anymore. It was 1,000 voices speaking through her, their collective presence seeping into every pore of the air, drowning him in their hunger. "You cannot escape," she whispered. James's mind snapped. He couldn't hear the voices anymore, couldn't make sense of the words. The air thickened with a suffocating pressure that pressed on him from all sides. The sand beneath his feet began to tremble, and the earth around him seemed to bend, as if everything was coming undone. His feet slid as the ground began to buckle beneath him. The sand, once solid and familiar, had become soft and treacherous, as though it were melting into a liquid. He struggled to maintain his balance, but it was impossible. The more he tried to move, the faster the sand pulled him down. The woman didn't move. She was watching him, her eyes vacant, her mouth open wide in silent accusation. James screamed, the terror of the moment choking him, but the sand rushed upward, swallowing his voice, swallowing him whole. He felt himself being pulled down into the earth, deeper and deeper, until his body was buried up to his chest. Panic clawed at his throat. His breath came in sharp gasps as the sand encased him, pulling him further into the depths. It felt wrong. This wasn't the natural course of things. This wasn't just sand. This was something else, something dark and ancient, something that lived. He reached out, his hands clawing at the sand, his fingers sinking into the soft, shifting mass. It felt as though it was moving, shifting beneath him, swirling around him like something alive, something that knew his fear. His skin burned as the sand tightened around him, as if it were constricting his very soul. He felt the cold fingers of the past creeping through the cracks in his mind, pulling him further into the dark, into the endless cycle of the beach. I can't. The thought broke apart as the last of the air left his lungs, his chest tightening painfully, as though his very breath were being stolen. His thoughts grew dim, and the last thing he felt was the cold, unrelenting weight of the sand wrapping itself around him, pressing down harder and harder until the footprints erased. I stared at the envelope, my fingers trembling ever so slightly as I ran them along the edge of the seal. It wasn't the first time I had received an anonymous letter, but this one was different. The weight of it, something far more sinister, lingered between its creases. I've been a detective for over 15 years, accustomed to the ordinary, the mundane. But there was something about this letter that tugged at the edges of my mind, something that screamed that this wasn't just another case. My mind instinctively went back to my early days in the force, when I had been naive, eager to solve mysteries, when I had not yet learned the bitter truth that some cases never get solved. They simply fade into the background, lost to time. But something about this letter, this strange, cryptic message, refused to fade. The paper was thick, old-fashioned. The typeface was worn, as if the ink had faded, leaving behind something ghostly and unsettling. I flipped it open slowly, my heart rate increasing. Inside, it read, "Your past is not buried." A chill ran down my spine. The words were few, but they hit harder than any assault I had ever encountered. Your past is not buried. I read the sentence again, trying to find meaning, to make sense of it. But I couldn't. The words were simple, but the message was not. I could feel the familiar tension creeping into my shoulders. That instinct, the one I had buried over the years, began to resurface. It had been too long since I felt this. Too long since I'd allowed myself to follow a lead, to chase the unknown. The envelope also contained something else. A photograph, creased and old, of a building I recognized. It was a dilapidated warehouse by the docks, a place I had visited many years ago during a case that had nearly destroyed me. There was a body back then. A young woman, her death still unsolved. We had all assumed it was an accident, a tragic mistake. But now, staring at the faded image in my hand, I wasn't so sure. Who would send me this? Why now? A dull noise pulled me out of my thoughts, a soft tapping at the window. I looked up, half expecting to see nothing, but there it was again. A shadow, quick, like something had just passed by. I stood up immediately, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The room was silent again. It wasn't the wind, no, the tapping had been rhythmic, deliberate. I walked to the window and peered outside. The street below was empty, just a few dimly lit lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. My breath slowed as I let my eyes adjust to the darkness. I told myself it was nothing, just my nerves getting the best of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I wasn't alone. Turning back to the table, I picked up the letter again. My eyes skimmed the words, trying to find some clue I had missed. The past, what was it referring to? And why me? Why now? The memory of the case from years ago came rushing back. The investigation that had led me into the shadow of the warehouse, the cold truth of the unsolved murder hanging over my head. I had been young then, naive. But the case had left a scar, a part of me I buried deep inside. I thought I had moved on. But the letter, this photograph, it was pulling me back in. Suddenly, the room felt too small, the air too thick. The walls, once so familiar, now seemed to be closing in on me. That sense of being watched returned, sharper now, like someone, was just outside the door. I reached for my coat, determination setting in. There was only one way to deal with this. I had to follow the lead. The past had finally caught up with me, and I would not allow it to bury me again. The street outside was quieter than I expected, the moon casting long, eerie shadows over the city. My footsteps echoed in the empty alley as I made my way toward the docks. My heart raced, the anxiety gnawing at me like a persistent itch I couldn't reach. I was closer now, closer to the place I had sworn to forget. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows reflecting the dim light. As I approached, a strange unease washed over me. The building seemed abandoned, just as I remembered it. But as I stood in front of it, I could feel it. Something was different. Something was watching. I stepped closer, the crunch of gravel under my boots breaking the stillness of the night. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to walk away. But the letter, the photograph, it had brought me here, and I was not turning back. My hand hovered over the handle of the door, the cold metal biting into my palm. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The smell of mildew clung to the walls, the remnants of old machinery scattered across the floor. But something else was there, something I couldn't name. A presence, cold and unfriendly. I stepped further into the building, my flashlight flickering as I moved. My mind raced, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. Every creak of the floorboards sent my pulse into overdrive. Then I saw it. A figure. A shadow in the corner of the room, barely visible. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, time seemed to slow down, the darkness around me pressing in like an unseen force. Was it a person? Or was it something else? I wasn't alone. And whatever waited for me in this place, this dark, forsaken place, was more than just a memory. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest as I focused on the shadow in the corner of the room. The light from my flashlight danced across the cracked walls, but the figure remained still, unmoving. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could feel its presence, sharp, cold, almost suffocating. Hello? My voice sounded weak, almost swallowed by the thick silence of the warehouse. It was a dumb question. Of course, it wouldn't answer. Yet, I couldn't help myself. Something told me that if I didn't break the silence, it would break me. The figure didn't respond. I took another step, my boots scraping against the floor. The shadows around me seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if the very air was alive with malevolent energy. I felt the weight of something heavy settling around me, like the room itself was breathing. I couldn't stop the tremor in my hands as I gripped the flashlight harder. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I ignored it. I had come this far, hadn't I? The letter had led me here, and whatever awaited me in this decrepit building wasn't going to stop me from uncovering the truth. Another step. Then, suddenly, the figure moved. It was quick. Too quick. A shadow sliding along the floor, merging with the darkness. For a moment, I wasn't sure if it had even been real. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, some deep-rooted fear in my mind manifesting itself. But then, I heard it. A whisper. Barely audible, like a soft breeze brushing past my ear. Leave. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. My breath caught in my throat as I swung the flashlight around, casting its beam across the room in frantic sweeps. There was nothing. No one. Just empty space, shadows, and the heavy silence pressing down on me. Was it the wind? My nerves? Leave, the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a broken chair that had been left discarded in the middle of the room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought, the more everything seemed to slip away. What had I heard? Who had spoken? The room felt smaller now, suffocating. The shadows seemed to move, inching closer to me with each passing second. My eyes darted to the corner where the figure had been. There, in the deepest part of the darkness, something glinted. Something metallic. I approached cautiously, my mind clouded with both fear and curiosity. I couldn't explain why, but something told me that the source of this cold, creeping dread, the thing that had brought me to this place, was closer than I wanted to believe. The glint was a shard of broken glass, catching the light as I drew near. I knelt down, my pulse racing in my ears as I reached out to touch it. As my fingers brushed the jagged edge, I realized the glass wasn't the only thing in the corner. The floor. It was stained. Dark, dried streaks that formed an unsettling pattern across the concrete. I leaned closer, my breath shaky as I tried to make out what it was. Blood. I recoiled in horror, almost knocking over a stack of boxes behind me. The smell hit me like a punch to the stomach, metallic, sharp, overwhelming. The room seemed to spin for a moment, the world around me warping. The blood had been here for a long time. Days. Weeks, maybe. My eyes darted to the walls, and I saw them scratch marks. At first, they looked like nothing more than wear and tear, but the deeper I looked, the clearer they became. Long, desperate scratches. The kind of marks made by someone, or something, trying to claw its way out. I shuddered, backing away from the corner, my breath quickening. What had happened here? Who had been trapped in this place? Then, I saw it. A message smeared across the floor, painted in the dried blood. The letters were jagged, as if hurriedly written by someone frantic, desperate. It was only a few words, but they burned into my mind with an intensity one couldn't shake. You shouldn't have come. My throat went dry. My hands clenched into fists. The letter. The photograph. They had all led me here. But now, standing in this room, the truth was becoming clearer, and it terrified me. I wasn't just here because of an old case. I wasn't just here because of some cryptic warning. This was about something far worse. Something that had been buried in the past and was clawing its way back to the surface. The whisper returned. This time, louder. Leave now. I spun around, the flashlight in my hand shaking violently as I searched the room. Nothing. No one. Just the dark shadows, the echoing silence, and the suffocating feeling of being watched. But I didn't leave. I couldn't. The blood-stained message on the floor, the cryptic warning, I couldn't walk away from it. I needed to know who had been here, what had happened. I had to find the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. As I moved toward the back of the warehouse, I heard a faint noise behind me. Soft footsteps. Barely a sound, but it was enough to freeze me in place. Someone else was here. Someone who had been waiting for me. I turned quickly, but nothing. No one. Then, the door slammed shut. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The sound was deafening in the otherwise silent room. My mind raced. Had someone locked me in? I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't just a simple case. It wasn't just about the old warehouse, or the cryptic letter, or even the bloodstains on the floor. This was a game. A game someone had been playing with me, and I had just walked right into it. And the worst part? I didn't know if I was the hunter or the prey. I took a step back, my chest heating with every breath, trying to steady my pulse. The door slammed shut, but the noise lingered in my mind, echoing like a warning. I pressed my hand against the cold metal, testing its weight, its resistance. It didn't budge. Locked. Trapped. The realization hit me like a cold slap to the face. I had been led here, but why? By whom? And for what? I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching me. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly since I entered. My breath was now visible in the dim light of my flashlight. The shadows around me seemed to grow longer, more threatening, as if they were reaching out to swallow me whole. I turned around slowly, trying to assess my surroundings. The warehouse was vast, far too vast for comfort. Tall, rusted shelves lined the walls, filled with forgotten items, their outlines barely visible in the gloom. Boxes, broken crates, discarded tools. It all seemed so mundane, so normal, but there was a sickening wrongness to it all. The floor beneath my feet creaked with each step, as if protesting my every movement. I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing in on me. Every sound felt magnified, the scratch of my boots on the gritty floor, the hum of the faint overhead lights, the distant dripping of water from somewhere deep within the building. The stillness was suffocating, the silence oppressive, as if this place had been abandoned not by time, but by choice. And yet, I knew I wasn't alone. I turned again, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do now? Should I call for backup? I pulled out my phone, the dim screen flickering to life. No signal. Typical. I was alone. And then the whisper came again. Soft. Haunting. Leave. It felt like it came from the very air around me, a ghostly presence that wasn't bound to a single point, but seemed to be all around me, suffocating me. My hands trembled, my throat tight with fear, but I fought it down. This wasn't the first time I had been in a dangerous situation. I'd been trained for this. My training told me to stay calm, to think. But there was something about this place that felt different. Wrong. The whispering didn't stop. It circled me, like the wind, pulling me in every direction. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was thickening in my mind. This was a game, wasn't it? Someone was toying with me, leading me down this path, manipulating me. I had to find the one behind it. Whoever they were, I needed to expose them. Suddenly, I heard something else. A sound, subtle at first. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from behind me. I froze. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping the room in an erratic arc, but there was nothing. Nothing at all. Just shadows, stretched and twisted by the light. My breath caught in my throat. Could it be my mind playing tricks on me? Was I already starting to unravel? But then, as if confirming my worst fear, I saw it. A figure. A shadow in the farthest corner, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, thin, almost skeletal. I couldn't make out any details, but its outline was unmistakable. It was standing still, watching me. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my knuckles white, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I needed to know who it was. Was it the person who had sent me the cryptic letter? The one who had left the blood-stained message on the floor? I took a cautious step forward, my boots making the faintest noise as I approached. The shadow didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for me, just as I had been waiting for it. Suddenly, the air shifted. A chill swept through the room, colder than before. The shadows seemed to shift, to writhe, as if they were alive. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the dark, leaving only the lingering feeling of its presence. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there. But the curiosity gnawed at me. I had to know. What was it? Who was it? The answer felt close. So close. I took another step forward, this time more determined. As I reached the corner where the figure had been standing, I saw something on the floor. A piece of paper, yellowed with age, crumpled into a ball. I knelt down and picked it up carefully. The message was scrawled in a hasty hand, the ink smudged in places as if the writer had been in a rush, or worse, distressed. Don't trust the signs. The marks are not for you. My stomach tightened. I knew this was a clue. It had to be. But what did it mean? What marks? Was this about the bloodstains on the floor? Or something else? I glanced around, the shadows feeling thicker, heavier. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how close I was to uncovering the truth. But at what cost? Who was behind this? Why was I being dragged into this web of mystery? I stood up, clutching the paper in my hand, and looked around again. The walls of the warehouse seemed to close in on me, the weight of the place pressing down, suffocating me. And then I heard it again. The whisper. It was louder now. Leave now. Or stay and die. My stomach twisted. I wasn't sure what was worse, the whisper itself, or the chilling finality in its words. I turned quickly, almost expecting to see something, or someone, right behind me. But there was nothing. Just the silence. The heavy, unrelenting silence that threatened to drive me insane. I didn't know how much longer I could stay. Every fiber of my being told me to leave, to get out before it was too late. But I was already too far in. I couldn't walk away now. Not while I was so close. And that's when I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper this time. A voice, clear and cold. Welcome to the game. My blood ran cold. I spun around. The room was empty. But the voice, it was unmistakable. I wasn't alone. The words echoed in my head, the voice lingering like a cold shadow. Welcome to the game. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just heard. Was this some kind of twisted joke? A threat? Or something more? The darkness in the warehouse felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me. I wasn't sure if I was still alone or if the shadows themselves were watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I glanced down at the crumpled piece of paper in my hand, the hastily written message still fresh in my mind. Don't trust the signs. The marks are not for you. But what did that mean? Who was I supposed to trust? Who was behind all this? I turned my attention back to the room, my eyes darting around as if expecting to see something lurking in the darkness. The stillness was maddening. The kind of silence that made every breath feel like a betrayal, every movement a potential signal to whatever might be lurking nearby. My flashlight's beam flickered once, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and I flinched. Something was wrong. This place, this entire situation, felt wrong. I stepped cautiously toward the back of the warehouse, the air thick with dust and the smell of rust. Each step seemed to reverberate in the silence, louder than the last. It was as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for me to take that next step into whatever nightmare awaited. My heart pounded in my chest, but I pressed on. I had to find answers. I had to understand what was happening here. The floor creaked beneath me, the sound almost deafening in the silence. My eyes scanned the rows of forgotten crates and shelves, the faint glow from my flashlight revealing only fragmented shapes, outlines of things that hadn't seen the light of day in years. The shadows seemed to move with me, stretching and shrinking as if they were alive. I fought the impulse to turn and run, but I couldn't. Not yet. The voice was still ringing in my ears. Welcome to the game. I couldn't shake it. It wasn't a message. It was a warning. Someone, something, was leading me deeper into this maze. But why? What did they want from me? I paused by one of the shelves, feeling the rough wood under my fingertips, trying to steady myself. The atmosphere in the warehouse was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of something I couldn't put into words. It felt like I was being watched, but by who? The shadows? The echoes of my own mind? Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker. A movement in the far distance. I whipped my head toward it, my heart skipping a beat. There was something there. It was just a silhouette at first, nothing more than a blur in the darkness, but it was moving. Slow. Deliberate. I couldn't tell what it was. It was too far away, too shrouded in shadow. But I knew it was something. Or someone. My breath caught in my throat as I took a hesitant step forward. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark, revealing glimpses of the figure, but not enough to make it out clearly. The closer I got, the more unsettling it became. The air grew colder. The silence deepened, wrapping around me like a blanket. The figure paused, just out of the range of my flashlight's glow. My heart raced in my chest. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. Something told me I didn't want to know who or what that was, not yet. Instead, I stepped back, retreating toward the opposite corner of the room. The figure followed me, keeping its distance, but its presence was undeniable. I could feel it, its eyes, its gaze, fixed on me. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me in, keeping me rooted to the spot. Was it a trap? The question gnawed at me, but I didn't have time to answer it. As I reached the far side of the warehouse, I stumbled upon a small desk, hidden in the shadows. Papers, old files, photographs everywhere. My pulse quickened as I rifled through the clutter, my hands trembling. There had to be something here, some clue, something to explain why I was being led here, why this place was so familiar yet so utterly alien. I picked up a photograph, yellowed with age. It was a grainy image of a man standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. The photograph was old, too old, but the man's face was unmistakable. The same face I had seen on the files earlier, the one connected to the cold case I had been investigating. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. No, this can't be right. I looked closer at the photograph. In the background, barely visible in the shadow of the building, was a symbol, a mark. It looked like something I had seen before, but I couldn't place it. It was subtle, almost as if it had been intentionally hidden. But there it was, unmistakable, etched into the concrete of the building. A mark. Just like the ones on the paper. The marks are not for you. I felt a tightening in my chest. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had been here before, just like I had. Someone had left these marks, left these clues. But why? What did it all mean? I turned around, looking over my shoulder. The figure was gone. No trace, no movement. The only thing left was the unsettling silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I glanced back down at the photograph. The man in the picture had been involved in something dark, something twisted. But what? And how did this all connect to me? The game. The whisper echoed in my mind once more. The game is just beginning. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest, but I shoved it down. I wasn't going to be intimidated. I couldn't afford to be. I had to keep going. The truth was within reach. And I wasn't about to stop now. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite name. It was as if the walls of the warehouse had grown closer, pressing on me, suffocating me with their silence. I had been here for what felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time seemed irrelevant now. The photograph in my hand felt colder, more significant with every passing second. The mark in the background of the picture, the one that seemed so familiar, so haunting, wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of something bigger. Something far darker than I had ever imagined. I couldn't help but wonder who the man in the photograph really was. The familiar face in the picture had become an obsession in my mind. The more I looked at it, the more questions bubbled to the surface. Who had he been? What had he known? And, more importantly, why had someone gone to such lengths to hide this connection? I glanced back at the desk, the files strewn across it like an abandoned crime scene. The room was colder now, the temperature dropping by the minute. The shadows, which had seemed harmless at first, were now watching me. I could almost feel them closing in around me, creeping along the walls, pressing against my back. I wasn't alone in this space. Not anymore. I stuffed the photograph into my pocket, the weight of the paper against my chest a reminder that the deeper I dug, the darker things seemed to become. The whispers in the back of my mind refused to quiet. The game is just beginning. That phrase, it kept looping in my head like a mantra. It was clear now that I was being drawn into something far more sinister than I had initially realized. The case I had thought was simple, the one I thought I had under control, was far from over. It was only just beginning, and I had no idea how deep it went. I turned and made my way toward the exit. My footsteps echoed in the empty space, each one louder than the last, as if the very walls were echoing my fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something lurking just beyond my sight. A presence that wasn't human. As I approached the door, a sudden noise broke the silence, a faint rustling sound, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I froze. My eyes snapped to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. Was it just the wind? Or was something moving in the darkness? I stepped back, instinctively reaching for the gun holstered under my jacket. My fingers grazed the cold metal, but I didn't draw it just yet. There was something in the air, a shift, a sudden weight. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if I was truly in danger. The rustling grew louder, closer now, as if whatever it was had shifted its position, was now standing just behind me. I could feel its presence, the way it pressed in on me from all sides. No. Stay calm. Just stay calm. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I had come here to find answers, not to become part of whatever this was. But the moment I entered this warehouse, I had been pulled into something much larger. A game I didn't understand, and a threat I couldn't see. The rustling stopped, and for a moment there was complete silence. Too silent. The kind of silence that preceded something horrible. I couldn't help but look over my shoulder. My flashlight being cut through the dark, but nothing was there. No figure, no movement. Just shadows. But I felt it. Something had changed. There was a presence in the room, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned back toward the door, but before I could take a step, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the distance. I spun around again, my pulse quickening. The footsteps weren't mine. They were too measured, too precise. Someone, or something, was coming for me. I tightened my grip on my gun, drawing it slowly from its holster. I had to stay alert. There was no telling who or what was out there. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out before it was too late, but something held me in place. It wasn't just fear. It was curiosity. A pull, deeper than I could explain, urging me to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, closer now, just beyond the corner of the room. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes locked on the darkness where the figure had vanished moments ago. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, as if alive, as if the very air had become something tangible, something that could reach out and touch me. Who are you? The thought screamed in my head, but I didn't dare speak it aloud. Not yet. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the faint light of my flashlight. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a hood. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but my voice faltered. Then it spoke. "You've come too far." The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of something older, something that had seen far more than I ever could. It was familiar, yet completely foreign. My gun trembled in my hand, but I didn't lower it. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What is this? What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it stepped forward, the movement slow and deliberate. The shadows around it seemed to bend, to follow it like a cloak. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a breath, it said, "You already know." And just like that, it disappeared back into the darkness. I stood there, frozen, staring into the blackness, my mind racing. What did that mean? What had I just heard? "You already know." It echoed in my mind as I slowly lowered my gun. This wasn't a random occurrence. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this was toying with me. The game was far from over, and I was already a pawn on the board. But I wasn't going to back down. Not now. I had come too far to stop. I didn't think it would happen to me. You know, when people talk about strange noises, things that go bump in the night, it always sounds so distant, like something that happens in movies or in some far-off, forgotten place. I never thought it could be real. But it was. and now I can't stop hearing it. The whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the pipes. Something harmless. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, it sounded more deliberate, like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't meant to hear. It all started on a Tuesday night. I had just moved into the building a week prior. A quiet, nondescript place tucked in a corner of the city, away from the hustle and bustle. The kind of building that blended into the backdrop of everyday life. You could almost forget it was there if you didn't pay attention. I had been living alone for some time, ever since I left the city behind to start fresh. New job, new apartment, new life, or so I had hoped. My past wasn't something I liked to think about. I kept it buried, sealed away in the darkest corners of my mind, where it couldn't haunt me. But it was hard to escape the past completely, wasn't it? I had just finished unpacking the last of my boxes when the first whisper reached my ears. It wasn't loud, just a faint murmur, like someone speaking from the other side of a thick wall. I stood still for a moment, straining to hear it again, but it stopped as quickly as it had started. I shook my head, attributing it to the old building's creaks and groans. The next night, I heard it again. Louder this time, like a voice that was just on the edge of comprehension. It sounded almost like a name, but it was distorted, muffled. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the neighbors. But even then, the building was too quiet, too still. I could feel my heart start to beat faster. Maybe it was just me being paranoid. It had been a long, stressful few months. The stress of moving, of starting over, had worn me thin. So, I told myself it was nothing. But then, the whispers came again. This time, they weren't just whispers. They were calls. They were direct, insistent, as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate with me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a threat, a promise of something that I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, my hands shaking. The apartment was silent again, but my mind kept playing the whispers over and over like a broken record. Was I hearing things? Was it just my imagination? I placed my ear to the wall. For a moment, I was sure I could hear something on the other side. There it was again, a low murmur, followed by a pause. Then, a louder voice. A voice that sounded almost angry. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I pulled away from the wall and backed into the hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My skin felt cold, as though the very air around me had thickened, pressing in on me. I looked down the hallway, my eyes darting to the door at the end. No one was there. The apartment complex was old, but it was never this unsettling. I could feel my pulse quicken as I turned, scanning the dimly lit rooms for any sign of life. But it was only me. Only my mind playing tricks, right? Right? I didn't think I could stay in that apartment any longer. The whispers, they were getting louder now. It wasn't just one voice anymore. I could hear them in multiple places, as though they were coming from different parts of the walls, converging into a single, unified voice. They were talking about me. I could feel it. But no one in the building had ever spoken to me directly. I barely knew anyone here, aside from the landlord, Mr. Walters, a quiet man who had greeted me on my first day. He had warned me that the building was old, that it had its quirks. Things creak, things groan, he had said, giving me a knowing look. You get used to it. I should have asked more questions. But I didn't. I was too eager to leave the past behind, too eager to move on. And now I was stuck here, in a place where the walls seemed to breathe, where every sound was distorted, and where I wasn't sure if I could trust my own mind. I had to know what was happening. I had to figure out what these whispers meant. I grabbed my jacket and walked out into the hallway. The building was quieter than it had ever been, almost unnervingly so. Every step I took felt like it was magnified 100-fold. I could hear the faint hum of the lights above me, the slow drip of a leaking faucet somewhere, but nothing else. As I passed the other apartments, I could feel eyes on me, though no one was there. The air was thick with tension, with something I couldn't explain. I approached the stairs that led down to the basement, the place I'd been warned to avoid. The basement was old, they said, filled with pipes and wiring that had never been properly maintained. The tenants before me had never used it. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers were coming from the basement. I was sure of it. I paused at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I should have turned back. I should have called someone, anyone, to check this out. But something told me that if I didn't go down there, if I didn't confront whatever was hiding in the dark, the whispers would follow me forever. I took a deep breath, and I opened the door. The door creaked as it swung open, sending a chill crawling up my spine. The hallway light flickered above me, casting long, unsettling shadows that seemed to stretch toward the stairs leading down into the basement. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, drying out every other sound. I hesitated. I shouldn't be doing this. It's crazy. But the whispers, they wouldn't let me go. They were relentless, persistent, clawing at my sanity. And every part of me knew that I had to go down there, to face whatever it was that was pulling me into this nightmare. The air around me grew heavier as I descended, the darkness pressing in like a physical weight. The stairs were old, they were creaking beneath my feet with every cautious step I took. I gripped the railing tightly, the cold metal sending a shock through my palm with each touch. It was almost as though the basement itself was alive, breathing beneath the building. As I reached the bottom, I was greeted by the scent of damp earth and mold. It clung to the air, thick and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and I saw that the basement was large, much larger than I had expected. The walls were lined with old wooden shelves, covered in dust, and there were a few broken boxes scattered across the floor. But none of that mattered. It was the silence that stood out most. The silence, save for the whispering. It was louder now. Louder and closer. I could hear it coming from the far corner of the basement, a whisper that seemed to echo off the walls, growing stronger with each passing moment. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I took a step forward. My breath was shallow, quick, as if my body was preparing for something, but I had no idea what. The basement was vast, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should have, as if something was hiding within them, watching me. I strained my ears to hear the words, but they were just beyond my reach. The whispers sounded distorted, garbled, like they were being spoken underwater. But the tone was unmistakable. They were speaking to me. "Why are you here?" the voice seemed to ask, though I couldn't be sure. It sounded like a question, but it was so faint, so distant, that I wasn't sure if it was real. My mind raced. I wanted to turn around, to run back up the stairs and forget this ever happened. But something kept me rooted in place. Something in the whispers, in the air, was holding me here. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to move forward, my eyes scanning the dimly lit corners of the room. Then, I saw it. A faint outline in the corner. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I took another step, the figure became clearer. It was a dark shape, standing motionless against the wall. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge my presence. It just stood there, watching me with a stillness that sent a wave of cold through my body. I stepped closer, my heart thumping violently in my chest, the whispers now growing louder in my ears. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices. Multiple voices, all overlapping, all speaking at once. They were frantic, urgent, like a chorus of something desperate, something that didn't want to be heard. And then I heard it clear as day. Get out. The voice was sharp, almost panicked, and it felt as though it had come from the walls themselves. I froze. My pulse quickened, and I could feel a bead of sweat form on my brow despite the cold air. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. But my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, in the farthest corner of the basement, I saw something else. Something worse. The shadows seemed to shift. The darkness twisted and writhed as if it had a life of its own. And then, emerging from the very fabric of the shadows, I saw a figure. A figure that wasn't quite human. It was tall, too tall. Its body was angular, unnaturally thin, and its limbs were elongated, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. The face, it had no face. Just smooth, pale skin that reflected no light. No features, no eyes, no mouth, just an expanse of nothingness. But I could feel its presence. I could feel it staring at me, even without a face. I tried to scream, to move, but my throat closed up. I could barely breathe. The whispers were louder now, overwhelming me, surrounding me, echoing off the walls, bouncing around my skull. The figure stepped forward, its limbs unnaturally slow, its movements jerky and deliberate. It was coming closer. I finally found my voice. I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't escape. I couldn't move fast enough. And then I heard something that chilled me to the core. Stay. The voice was right behind me, almost a whisper against my ear. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness. The figure was gone. The whisper stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I ran up the stairs. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment. The door slammed behind me. I collapsed against it, my breath ragged, my body trembling uncontrollably. I could still hear the whispers, faintly, in the back of my mind. But now, they were gone from the walls. I couldn't stay there any longer. Something was in that basement. Something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. And it was waiting for me. I couldn't sleep. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in on me, the silence pressing heavily against my chest. The faintest creak of the floorboards, the softest whisper of air, everything felt like a threat now. Every sound made me flinch, made my heart race. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand. I spent the night pacing, running my fingers through my hair, the smell of mold and dust still fresh in my mind. The basement was still a haunting image, those long, unnaturally thin limbs, the empty, featureless face. I could see it every time I closed my eyes. I could hear its whispers echoing in my skull. They hadn't stopped, not completely. Every so often, they would return, like a distant murmur from just beyond my consciousness. "Stay," it had said. Those words lingered, burning into my thoughts like a scar. I had to go back, but I wasn't sure I could. The fear, the unease, I didn't know how to face it again. But it was like a sickness eating away at me. The basement, the thing down there, it was calling me, drawing me in. I had to finish it. I had to uncover the truth. The next morning, I returned to the building. The air felt heavier as I stood in front of the entrance, the once comforting familiarity of the worn brick and faded paint now twisted into something sinister. The building seemed to loom over me, its windows dark, its shadow stretching out like a hungry hand. I paused in front of the door, my hand resting on the cool metal. My mind was racing, my stomach twisted into knots. But I pushed the door open anyway, stepping into the lobby. The building was eerily quiet, too quiet. I could hear nothing but the sound of my footsteps as I walked through the narrow corridor, past the old, peeling wallpaper. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air. It was the same as it had been the night before, but it felt different now. Heavier. Like the entire building was holding its breath. I made my way to the basement door, my heart hammering in my chest with every step. The whispers from the night before still lingered in my ears, their words just beyond comprehension. I didn't know if they were real or if they were just a product of my fraying sanity, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something was waiting. I stood in front of the door for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I could almost hear the whispers again, this time clearer, more urgent. "You don't belong here," they seemed to say. I opened the door. The familiar smell of dampness greeted me, and the air felt cold, colder than it had been the day before. The basement stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, just as I remembered. But this time, there was something different. Something more oppressive. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath me. The light from the hallway flickered above, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with me. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to keep moving despite the icy dread settling in my bones. I knew I had to face it. I couldn't just keep running. The basement seemed to stretch on farther than it had before, the shelves and boxes now blurred in the dim light. My footsteps echoed louder in the silence, a reminder of my isolation. And then, there it was. The whispering. But it wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real. It was coming from the farthest corner of the basement. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there. Something that shouldn't be. I felt it. Slowly, I stepped toward the corner, my eyes straining against the darkness. The shadows seemed to twist and warp around me, like they were alive, and the whispering grew louder with every step I took. It was clear now. The voice wasn't just one voice. It was many, layered on top of each other, all speaking at once. The words were nonsensical, broken, as if they were speaking through layers of static, but there was a pattern to them. A rhythm. I had to get closer. I had to understand what it was saying. I reached the far corner of the basement and stopped. My breath was ragged, my heart thundering in my chest. The shadows there seemed deeper than anywhere else in the room, darker. The air felt thicker, almost as though I were breathing underwater. And then, in the blackness, I saw something. A shape, barely visible against the dark, but unmistakable. A figure. It was standing still, motionless, as if it had been waiting for me. Its shape was distorted, blurry, shifting like it was made of smoke, but as I stared at it, it became clearer. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs stretched out in odd, angular ways. Its presence filled the space, pushing against the walls. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, nothing happened. The figure just stood there, unmoving, watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as though my body had forgotten how to function. And then it moved. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward me. Its movement was jerky, unnatural, as though it were dragging itself through the air instead of walking. Each step echoed through the basement, and I could feel the weight of it in my chest, like something was pulling at my insides. I took a step back, then another, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my ears, filling my skull. I could hear the words clearer, but they made no sense. They were a tangled mess of voices, overlapping, frantic. Get out. The words were loud enough to rattle my bones. I could feel them vibrating in the air around me. I turned and ran. My legs finally obeyed, carrying me up the stairs, my heart pounding in my throat. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. But I could still feel it. The whispers. The presence. It was still with me. And I knew it wasn't done. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind wouldn't stop spinning, replaying the events in the basement over and over again. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, those long, twisted limbs, the darkness that seemed to seep from its very being, the way it moved with such unnatural grace. It haunted me, like it had become a part of me. Its whispers, muffled but ever-present, echoed in my head, mixing with the sounds of the city outside, creating a cacophony of noise that refused to leave. By morning, I knew I couldn't just ignore it anymore. The truth was, I was terrified. I was terrified of what I had seen and what I still couldn't understand. The figure, the whispers, it was all too much to process. But I also knew I couldn't walk away from it. Not now. Not while I was so close to uncovering something hidden behind the walls of this cursed building. I grabbed my coat and forced myself to leave the apartment. My legs felt weak as I stepped into the hallway, the usual hum of the building's aging pipes now eerily silent. The building seemed to press in on me, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I had to find out more. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. Whatever had happened down there, whatever I had witnessed, it was connected to the building. The people who had lived here before me, maybe they knew something. Or maybe they had become part of the same thing I had seen. I walked down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The lobby felt oppressive, as if something was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The front door felt far too distant, too unreachable, but I pushed forward. My destination was the building's archives, an old, musty room filled with forgotten files. A place where the history of the building was kept hidden away, gathering dust. The room was as I remembered it, dimly lit, the shelves crammed with papers and forgotten boxes, some of them so old the labels were barely legible. I searched through the dusty files, my fingers brushing over yellowing papers, photographs, and documents, each one whispering a story of the past. I was looking for anything that could explain what had happened, what was happening to me. The deeper I dug, the more unsettled I became. There were records of tenants, of maintenance work, but nothing that stood out. Nothing that made sense. But then I found something. A single file, tucked away in a corner, wedged between two old tenant leases. I pulled it out, my heart racing. It was a tenant report from years ago, dated 20 years prior. The name on the file was familiar, Mary Thompson. I had seen that name before. It was one of the names listed in the building's original tenant history, someone who had lived here before me. But it wasn't the name that caught my attention. It was the description. The notes were sparse, but they detailed strange occurrences, whispers, strange sounds, feelings of being watched. The same things I had experienced. But then there was something else. A line that sent a chill down my spine. Tenant claims to have seen something in the basement. Describes it as not human. Requests to move out immediately. I stared at the paper, trying to process the words. The same thing had happened to her. Mary Thompson had been driven out of this place by the same presence that haunted me now. I turned the page, desperate to find more, but there was nothing more. Just a blank space where the final day of her departure should have been. The silence of the room was broken by a sudden, loud creak, a floorboard groaning underfoot, as if someone else was there. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. My eyes darted around the room. There was no one else in the archives. I was alone. I thought. Then, from the back of the room, I heard it. The faintest whisper, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then it came again, clear this time. Leave. The voice was not my own. It was soft, drawn out, like it was being pulled from the depths of the earth itself. My pulse quickened as I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone, but there was no one there. Just the shelves, the dust, the forgotten history of the building. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was the stress. But deep down, I knew better. The whispers were real. They were in my head, but they were also here, in this room, in the building. I wasn't imagining it. This place, this cursed building, was alive with something dark. Something that I was too close to understanding. With trembling hands, I gathered the papers I had found and rushed out of the room, but as I turned the corner into the hallway, I froze. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was a shadow. A figure. Tall, thin, and impossibly still. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, like it was pulling me toward it, drawing me in with an invisible force. The whisper came again, louder this time, clearer. Stay. I took a step back, my body shaking. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each step echoing down the empty hallway. And then it spoke again. You shouldn't have come back. The figure in the hallway was no longer just a shadow. It was something more, something real. I could see it now, more clearly than before. Its form was tall, impossibly tall, and thin, almost skeletal. The skin, if it could even be called that, was stretched tight across its bones, pale and mottled in places. Its eyes, no, its gaze, was nothing more than two dark pits, blacker than the void, as if they were sucking in the very light around them. I couldn't look away. It was as if the figure had anchored me to the spot with its mere presence. I tried to swallow, but my throat had gone dry. I wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but all I could do was stand there, rooted in place, paralyzed by the overwhelming dread that had consumed me. "Why are you here?" the figure's voice rasped, the sound like nails scraping against stone. It wasn't just in my ears, it was in my head, echoing in my mind, a whisper that seemed to burrow deep into my consciousness. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The words were stuck, caught in the choking knot of fear that had taken over my chest. My heart thudded in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure moved closer, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't have been able to, joints cracking unnaturally with each step. I wanted to turn and flee, but I was frozen, unable to tear my gaze away from it. It was like the air itself had thickened, pressing down on me, trapping me in this suffocating moment. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure repeated, its voice deeper now, almost a growl. It was close enough now that I could feel its breath, cold and damp, like the air inside a tomb. I could see its chest rise and fall, if it even had a chest, as it breathed in the stale, musty air of the building. The whispers, those damn whispers, began again, louder now, like a chorus of voices calling from every direction. "Leave, leave, leave." They circled around me, closing in, overlapping, until I could no longer tell if they were real or just a product of my terror. I tried to speak, to ask it what it wanted, what was happening, but all I could manage was a strangled gasp. My legs shook, threatening to give way beneath me. The figure raised one long, bony finger toward me, its nails impossibly long, like claws, sharp enough to tear through flesh. "You're too late," it said, its voice now low and dripping with malice. "The wall is listening. It's waiting." I didn't understand. What wall? What was it talking about? I wanted to scream at it to explain, to tell me everything, but the words died on my lips. The air in the hallway seemed to shift, the walls themselves seemed to pulse, like the building was alive, breathing, waiting. And then, with a sudden, sickening snap, the figure was gone. It wasn't a fading into shadow, or a slow retreat. It just vanished, like it had never been there at all. But the silence that followed was even worse. It was as if the world itself had stopped turning, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. The whispers faded, but the dread remained, lingering like a shadow in the corner of my mind. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What had I seen? What was that thing? My thoughts were jumbled, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The building felt colder now, the walls pressing in tighter around me, as though they were closing in with every step I took. I didn't dare look behind me, afraid that the figure would be waiting, or that the walls themselves would come alive and trap me in this nightmare. When I reached the door to the street, I slammed it open, rushing out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. The city around me was eerily quiet, the streets empty, the lights dim. It was as if the entire world had been swallowed up by the darkness of the building. But even outside, I couldn't escape it. The whispers, those soft, eerie whispers, were still there, faint but unmistakable. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were everywhere, a constant presence in the background, creeping into my thoughts, into my very soul. I tried to shake it off, to push the fear aside, but it wouldn't go away. The feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, was overwhelming. I turned to look over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street stretching out before me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was still calling to me, still pulling me back in. The whispers were there, and they weren't going to stop until I faced whatever was hiding behind the walls. And as I stood there, trembling in the cold, I realized the truth. It wasn't just a building that was alive. It was something much worse. Something older. Something that had been here long before I arrived and would remain long after I was gone. The whispers would never stop. And neither would I. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.